This land was old before any man called it his. Out along the Arizona and New Mexico line, around 1882, maybe 1883, the world was mostly red rock and high desert. The wind had a habit of talking to itself as it whipped through the canyons, telling stories nobody could quite understand. It was hard country. It baked in the sun and froze in the shadows. Mesquite Crossing was not much of a town. It was a scar. Really, it had sprung up where the stagecoach line crossed the dry wash. And now, folks said the railroad was laying tracks just 10 miles south. It was a place of dust, sweat, and mule dung. A collection of raw lumber buildings huddled together, pretending they belonged. Eliza Hart was 22 years old, and she felt older than the high plains. She stepped off the rattling stagecoach carrying one small carpet bag and a spine made of good steel. She was an orphan, raised by the nuns back in Santa Fe, and she knew her letters better than most men knew their whiskey. She was also a woman trying to outrun a shadow. Back in Santa Fe, a lie had attached itself to her, sticky as pine tar. It was not her lie, but people started to look at her sideways, whispering about her virtue. There was no virtue left in a place that only saw sin. So she had taken her small savings and headed west, looking for a place where her name was just her own. She was headed for Langtry's Depot. She was applying for the job of cook. It was not a grand ambition, but it was an honest one. All Eliza wanted was a clean start, a roof that did not leak gossip, and the right to earn her keep without being judged by ghosts. The depot was run by Martha Langtry, a widow whose face looked like a map of the territory. She hired Eliza that same afternoon. Her terms were simple. "I need reliability. Girl," Martha said, her eyes sweeping Eliza from her worn boots to her tidy hair. "I do not need trouble. Marshal Abel Crane keeps an eye on this depot. He is partners, some say, with Cyrus Pike." Eliza knew the names. Even in Santa Fe, she had heard of Cyrus Pike. He was a man who measured his wealth in land and water. He owned the big cattle operation up in the valley and half the businesses in Mesquite Crossing. He was a man who did not like sharing, especially not with the Dine, the Navajo people, who had been on this land since the Creator shaped it. Pike wanted the whole valley, and Marshal Crane, with his silver star and his heavy holster, usually made sure Pike got what he wanted. "My business is the kitchen, ma'am," Eliza said, her voice quiet but clear. Martha nodded, seeming satisfied. "Good. The rule here is simple. Be silent. Be diligent. Do not make trouble. The stove is yours." The depot was a world unto itself. It smelled of axle grease, hot iron from the blacksmith's forge, stale beer, and the sharp scent of alkali dust. Teamsters, their face cracked leather from the sun, moved in and out, cussing their mules and praising Eliza's coffee. A young pastor, barely older than Eliza, stopped by for mail, his books looking out of place. A few women sold jerky and rough-woven blankets near the corral. And there was Tomas. He was 15 years old, maybe, all elbows and feelings. He helped Martha with the ledgers and swept the porch, but his eyes were always watching, always feeling the shape of things. He took a quick liking to Eliza, sensing, perhaps, that she also knew what it was like to be on the outside of things. The air in Mesquite Crossing was thick with more than dust. It was thick with rumor. A week prior, a freight wagon had been hid out on the flats, robbed clean. The rumor, pushed hard by Marshal Crane, was that it was a band of Dine. Crane was using it as an excuse, tightening the rope. He wanted the native families moved off their ancestral watering spot, a place called Coyote Spring. Pike wanted the water. The robbery was a convenient excuse to call them dangerous. But the Dine who passed through the depot were not dangerous. They were guides, traders, families. One such man was known to the white folk as Ash. His people called him Ta-Ilichi, which meant ash red. He was 26. He was a warrior, but he did not wear his history like a threat. He wore it like the land itself, quiet and deep. He had the calm of a man who knows he can hit what he aims at. He understood the wind, the tracks of a lizard, the way the rocks held the heat. He worked for a native freight company, escorting wagons, guiding them through passes that maps only guessed at. He came to the depot near sundown, just as the sky was bruising purple and orange over the mesas. The day's heat was finally breaking. Ash moved without noise. He entered the dining hall. It was a long, rough room with 2 trestle tables. Eliza was behind the counter, serving the last of the teamsters. He put his coins on the wood. He did not speak much, just enough. "Supper." Eliza looked up. It was not a long look. It was not the kind of look that movies or dime novels are made of. It was the look of 2 people recognizing the weight in each other. She saw a stillness in him, an integrity that did not need to shout. He saw a woman who stood straight, whose hands were clean, and whose eyes were clear, even if they were sad. She turned away first. She plated his food. It was simple fare, a thick stew of pinto beans and salt pork, a heavy wedge of cornbread, and a tin mug of scalding black coffee. The kitchen smelled of it, the smell of survival in the high desert. She served him in silence. He took the plate and sat alone at the far end of the table, facing the door. Eliza busied herself, wiping the counters, stacking the heavy plates. Ash ate slowly, deliberately. He did not shovel it down like the teamsters. He tasted his food. When he was finished, he brought the plate to the counter. He nodded once. Eliza nodded back. He left as quietly as he had arrived, dissolving into the deep blue twilight. Eliza finished her work, cleaning the great black stove until it shone dully in the lantern light. She felt the silence of the depot settle around her. It was a heavy quiet, full of things unsaid. She wanted freedom. She thought freedom was just a quiet life, a place where the truth of her own character was enough. Ash, walking back toward the foothills, wanted freedom. Too, his was the freedom for his people to breathe, to drink from the water their grandfathers had drunk from, to live on the land that held their stories, a freedom that was being choked by men like Pike and Crane. Both Eliza and Ash understood something. They understood that noise was dangerous, rumors, lies, and boasts. They were the tools of lesser men. They had both learned, the hard way, the high price of being noticed. They had learned the value of silence. The wind changed 3 nights later. It came down from the high mesas not as a breeze, but as a judgment. A wall of red dust, visible for 50 miles, moved in to swallow the sun at 4 in the afternoon. Eliza felt the pressure change before she heard the noise. The air in the kitchen grew heavy and thin, making the lanterns flicker. She stopped kneading the dough for the morning bread, her hands white with flour. Then the sound began. It was a low moan that built to a shriek, the sky tearing itself apart. Grit began to force its way through every crack in the depot's plank walls. It was a sandstorm, the kind the old-timers spoke of with a fearful respect. Martha Langtry bolted the main doors. The teamsters who were stranded inside cursed the weather and played cards, their voices loud to be heard over the howl. Eliza stuffed rags under the kitchen door, but the fine, stinging dust still found its way in. It settled on the hot stove, hissing. It coated the clean plates. It got in her teeth, a bitter taste of the high, empty country. The storm raged all night, a blind red fury. Sometime after midnight, Eliza, trying to sleep on her small cot behind the kitchen, thought she heard the crack of gunshots. She sat up, her heart pounding, but the wind was slamming a loose shutter against the depot wall. Bang, bang, bang. She told herself it was just the storm. She laid back down, but she did not sleep. The air itself felt violent. When the sun rose, the world was changed. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy as lead. The sky was a pale, bruised yellow. Everything, the corrals, the water trough, the entire town of Mesquite Crossing, was covered in a smooth, rippling blanket of red sand. The world was scoured clean, but the air felt wrong. It was just after 7. the air still cold, when Marshal Abel Crane rode into the depot's yard. He was not alone. He had 2 deputies and 3 prisoners. The prisoners were Din, 2 men and a younger boy, not much older than Tomas. Their hands were bound tight with rope, and they were forced to walk, stumbling in the deep sand, behind the marshal's horse. Eliza was on the porch, sweeping away the drift of sand that had piled against the door. She froze, the broom still in her hand. Marshal Crane dismounted, his spurs jingling. He was a thick man, his face burned red by the sun and whiskey. He enjoyed his authority. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the red sand. "Mornin', Martha," he boomed, seeing the widow appear in the doorway. "Had a busy night. Seems we found your robbers."
"My robbers?"
Martha asked, her voice thin. "The freight wagon. Hit last night out at Dry Wash," Crane announced, loud enough for the gathering teamsters to hear. "Driver's dead. Scalped. We caught these ones trying to bury the plunder." He kicked a heavy canvas sack that one of his deputies had cut from a horse. The contents spilled onto the porch, a few silver conchos, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, a broken rifle. It was then that Ash appeared. He came from the east, walking, not riding. He moved with that same quiet purpose Eliza had seen before. He did not look at Crane. He looked at the 3 prisoners. His face, usually so calm, was carved from stone. "Marshal," Ash said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the morning air. Crane turned, his hand dropping to his holster in a practiced gesture of intimidation. "Well, look who it is. Come to see your handiwork. Ash." "They are my kin," Ash said simply. He looked at the 2 older men. "I am here to pay for them." Crane laughed. A short, ugly sound. "Pay for them. There is no price for this. This is murder. We caught 'em, and they will hang." "They are not murderers," Ash said. The stillness in him was absolute. "Tell that to the dead man at Dry Wash." Crane sneered. He gestured to the spilled evidence. "They were wearing war paint, screaming like devils. The boys who found the wagon said so, and here is the proof." Eliza had not moved. She was trapped, watching. Her duty was to the kitchen. Her rule was to be silent. But her eyes were fixed on the jumble of items on the porch. She saw the broken rifle. She saw the conchos. And she saw the knife. It was a large butcher knife, its blade dark with what Crane wanted them to believe was blood. But Eliza was not looking at the blade. She was looking at the handle. It was a heavy wooden handle, worn smooth by years of use. Near the hilt, a previous owner had carved a small, rough initial. She knew that knife. She had used it yesterday morning to joint a chicken. It was Martha Langtry's knife, kept in the block on the kitchen counter. It had been there when she went to bed before the storm. Her blood went cold. She felt the air leave her lungs. It was a lie. The whole thing was a lie. The knife had been taken from her kitchen. Someone inside the depot, someone who ate her food, had given it to Crane to plant. She looked at Ash. He was facing Crane, his body braced, absorbing the marshal's hate. He was losing. He had no proof. Eliza had the proof, but she was a woman with a past, desperate for a clean start. To speak was to invite ruin. Crane was still talking. "You dine are all the same. Think you own this land. Pike is right. Time you were cleared out, starting with Coyote Spring." Ash's gaze flickered. He glanced past the marshal, his eyes sweeping the depot, looking for an ally he did not have. His gaze met Eliza's for less than a second. She did not speak. She did not point. She was frozen in the doorway, but she met his look. Her eyes wide with the sudden, terrible knowledge, dropped from his face, down to the knife on the porch, and then back up to his. It was enough. Ash's expression did not change, but she saw the intelligence gather in his eyes. He understood. He did not know how she knew, but he knew she was telling him the evidence was false. The white cook, the silent woman. had just confirmed the setup. He turned his gaze back to Crane. The stillness was different now. It was not just patience. It was cold, focused rage. But he knew he could not win. Not here, not now. "Take him," Crane ordered his deputies. He shoved the young dine boy, who stumbled but was held up by one of the older men. "We'll hold him at the Mesquite jail for the circuit judge." As the posse moved out, dragging the prisoners through the sand, a buggy pulled up. Cyrus Pike. He was dressed, as always, in a dark suit and a string tie, looking untouched by the storm. He had not come to get dirty. He had come to inspect the results. "Marshal," he said, his voice smooth. "A successful morning. I see. You have my thanks. The settlers in this valley will sleep safer." "Just doing my job, Mr. Pike," Crane said, touching his hat. Pike's eyes left the marshal and scanned the depot. They passed over Martha, who was wringing her hands, and settled on Eliza, who was still standing in the doorway. Pike smiled, a thin expression that did not touch his eyes. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Langtry, I see you found a new cook." "Yes, Mr. Pike," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is Eliza Hart. Miss Hart." He let his gaze linger on her. It was not a look of desire. It was a look of assessment, like a man judging livestock. "I do hope she understands her place. A depot is a busy place, full of talk." He stepped closer to the porch, forcing Eliza to step back into the shadow of the kitchen. "Good cooks," Pike said softly, his voice a purr of menace. "Know that the most important ingredient is silence, noise, opinions. They can ruin a meal, spoil the whole town's appetite. We would not want that, would we?" Eliza saw Martha flinch. She saw the raw fear in the older woman's eyes, the unmistakable look of a person trapped by debt. Pike owned the bank. He owned the mortgage on this depot. He owned Martha. And he was telling Eliza that he could own her, too. Eliza stood her ground, her face pale but her spine straight. She said nothing. "Good," Pike said, as if she had answered. He turned and climbed back into his buggy. "Good day, ladies." He drove off, leaving the stench of his cigar smoke hanging in the clean, cold air. Eliza was left with the choice. It was Santa Fe all over again. But this time it was not a rumor. It was a lie that would hang 3 men. She could keep her job, keep Martha safe, and live with the silence. Or she could honor the truth that she and Ash now shared, and in doing so, bring the entire weight of Cyrus Pike and Marshall Crane down on her head. Ash had vanished during Pike's arrival. Eliza retreated to the kitchen, her sanctuary, which now felt like a trap. The knife was gone. She was supposed to forget it. She worked through the day, her hands moving with practiced rhythm, but her mind was racing. She scrubbed the grit from the cast iron. She baked the bread she had started the night before. She served the midday meal to the teamsters, who talked loudly of the raid, celebrating Crane's quick justice. "Scalped him," they said, one man announced, his mouth full of beans. "They ought to hang 'em all." Eliza's stomach turned. She felt the lie in her throat, a physical sickness. Late in the afternoon, Thomas came into the kitchen. The boy was quiet, his usual energy gone. "Eliza," he said, his voice low. "Yes, Thomas." "That dine man, Ash. He found me by the corral. He was waiting in the shadows. He told me to tell you something." Eliza stopped wiping a tin plate. She looked at the boy. "What did he say?" Thomas looked scared, as if the words themselves were dangerous. He said, "The truth is in the wagon tracks. Coyote Spring holds the mark." He made me repeat it. "What does it mean?" "Eliza." "He trusts me." The thought was sharp and sudden. He was not running. He was fighting. He was going to Drywash to find the real tracks, the ones that were not made by men on foot. And he believed the spring. The water Pike wanted was the reason. He had counted her as an ally. She put down the plate. It means he is a smart man. Thomas, thank you. Now, do not repeat that to anyone. Not even Martha.
I will not,
The boy whispered, his eyes wide. When he left, Eliza was alone again with the sounds of the stove. The sun was setting, painting the sand-covered world in hues of blood and gold. She had her answer. She walked to the small desk where Martha kept the depot's accounts. She pulled out the heavy, cloth-bound ledger. She opened it to the section marked Kitchen Inventory. She dipped a steel nib pen into the inkwell. Her hand did not shake. Her penmanship was clear and strong, the one thing the nuns had praised her for. She wrote the date. Underneath, she wrote inventory check following sandstorm. Supplies accounted for flour, 3 sacks, beans, 1 barrel, lard, 2 pails, coffee, 1 sack. She paused, took a breath, and dipped the pen again. Items missing: 1 large butcher knife, 10-inch blade, wooden handle with L carved near hilt, presumed stolen during the night of the storm. It was a small act, a quiet entry in a dusty book. It was not a shout, it was not an accusation. It was just the truth, recorded, dated, and witnessed by the ink. It was her first act of defiance. It was a thread of law, thin as a spider's silk, but it was hers. She carefully blotted the page and closed the heavy book. Outside, the first stars pricked the purple sky. The dust of Crane's posse was hours gone, swallowed by the horizon. Eliza looked at her fingers, smudged with ink. She knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones, that she was no longer running from the past. She had just bought into a fight for the future. The depot changed after Marshal Crane took the prisoners. The air, once just dusty and smelling of coffee and iron, now turned sour. A whisper had started, slithering from the saloon to the general store and back to the depot. That new cook at Langtry's, the quiet one.
What about her?
They say she is thick with the dine. They say she passed a sign to that Ash fellow. It was a lie born of Pike's menace and Crane's bluster. But it grew legs. Teamsters who used to tip their hats now just stared, their eyes hard and suspicious. The tables in the dining hall, usually full at 6, were half empty. The cash in Martha's tin was lighter. Martha Langtry was a strong woman, but she was a woman caught in a vice. Pike's debt hung over her, and now the loss of business was choking her. She began to snap at Eliza over small things. The coffee was too bitter. The bread was too dense. "You are bringing trouble, girl," Martha said one afternoon, her hands twisting in her apron. "I told you, no trouble." "The trouble was already here, ma'am," Eliza said quietly, scrubbing a pot. "I just saw it." "Seeing it and inviting it to supper are 2 different things," Martha hissed. Before her fear turned to misery, and she retreated to her small office. Only Thomas remained unchanged. The boy's admiration for Eliza had only grown. He saw her stand up to Pike's shadow, and he saw the lie of the marshal. He made a point to help her, bringing in firewood without being asked. His quiet presence a small shield against the town's cold stare. Eliza continued her work. She cooked, she cleaned, she kept her silence. But now, it was a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of retreat. It was the silence of a hunter, waiting. 3 nights after the arrest, the air was still and hot. Eliza was finding it hard to breathe in the small room behind the kitchen. She needed to check the flour supply for the morning's baking, a task that brought a small moment of peace. The main storehouse was a separate building, set back 20 yards from the depot, cooler at night. She took a lantern, its yellow light cutting a small, brave circle in the thick darkness. The stars were brilliant, a cold fire overhead. As she approached the storehouse, she heard voices, low, angry. She blew out her lantern, plunging herself into the dark, and crept closer, pressing her back against the rough plank wall. Do not care if the boy is still in there," a gravelly voice said. Eliza recognized it. Lou Harker, a man who did Pike's dirty work, a drinker and a bully who often hung around the depot corrals. Pike just said to make it look like the dine, a second voice whined. He did not say nothing about burning the whole depot down? He said to send a message. Harker growled. This depot is getting too friendly with the Reds. A little fire, blamed on Ash's friends. Crane is already ready to ride. This will just give him the excuse he needs to clear out Coyote Spring for good. Eliza heard the scrape of a match. That is oil, you fool, the second man yelped. It burns faster. Now come on, we light it from the inside. Make it look like they was trying to steal. Then we run. Eliza's heart was a cold knot in her chest. She had to stop them. She looked for a rock, a piece of wood, anything. Before she could move, she heard a door slam and the heavy, unmistakable sound of a crossbar dropping into its iron brackets. They were locking it from the outside. Then she heard a third sound, a muffled cry, from inside the storehouse. It was Tomas. She ran to the door, pounding on the thick wood. Thomas, are you in there? A moment of terrified silence. Then his voice, high with panic. Eliza, help me the lock. They locked me in and I smell smoke. Eliza. He had followed her. Or perhaps Harker's boy was not a figure of speech. Maybe they had grabbed Thomas when he stumbled upon them. It did not matter. She threw her shoulder against the door. It did not budge. The bar was heavy. She clawed at it, her fingers splitting on the rough wood. Stand back from the door! Tomas! She yelled. A flicker of orange light appeared under the door. Then another. The smoke was no longer a smell. It was a visible, choking thing, pouring from the cracks in the walls. Fire! She screamed, her voice tearing. Fire at the depot! She grabbed a nearby axe, kept for splitting kindling, and attacked the iron bracket holding the bar. Sparks flew, but the metal held. The wood around it was beginning to smoke. Eliza, it is hot, Tomas cried, his voice breaking in a cough. The entire wall was hot now. The flames were roaring inside. She had seconds. She raised the axe again, screaming with effort. A hand closed over hers, stopping the blow. She spun, terrified. The axe raised. It was Ash. He was just there, a shadow detached from the other shadows. He must have been watching the depot, drawn by the same unease she had felt. He had seen the men run. He had heard her scream. He did not speak. He took the axe from her hand as if taking a cup of water. He ignored the bracket. He swung the heavy, blunt end of the axe head straight at the padlock itself. The first blow dented the iron. The second shattered the shackle. The bar fell. Ash ripped the door open. A wall of heat and black smoke rolled out, throwing them both back. Ash dropped to the ground, pulling Eliza with him. Tomas, she choked. Ash was already moving, low to the ground, a wet cloth she had not seen him carry now over his face. He disappeared into the inferno. It was the longest 5 seconds of Eliza's life. The dining hall was lit up now, men shouting, Martha screaming. Then Ash was back, half dragging, half carrying the coughing, soot-blackened form of Tomas. He hauled the boy onto the clear ground and turned, his eyes on Eliza. He is breathing, Ash said. Arrest him. The voice was Marshal Crane's. He and 3 deputies were suddenly there, guns drawn, their horses lathered. They had arrived too fast, far too fast, as if they had been waiting down the road. Caught you red-handed, boy, Crane said, his gun aimed at Ash's chest. First murder, now arson. You are a busy man. Ash slowly raised his hands. He was standing between the marshal and Eliza, shielding her. He did not do this, Eliza said, her voice rough from the smoke. She got to her feet, helping Thomas sit up. Ma'am, I saw what I saw, Crane said, his eyes glittering in the firelight. He was pulling the body out, probably trying to hide his work. He was saving him, Eliza said. She walked past Ash, planting herself directly in front of the marshal. Her dress was singed. Her face was black with soot. but her eyes were clear. "Marshal," she said, her voice not loud, but it carried, "You are a man of the law. You should look at the evidence." "The evidence is a burnin' buildin' and a dead dine," Crane sneered, gesturing at Ash.
"The evidence,"
Eliza said, pointing not at Ash, but at the storehouse door, "is right there." The crowd quieted. Martha, the teamsters, even Crane's deputies all looked. "That is the depot's main oil barrel," Eliza said, her voice methodical, like a woman taking inventory. "It is just inside the door. Its lid is tossed on the floor. Inside. The fire was started from in there. Using that oil. Tell me, Marshal, how does a man outside the building open a barrel that is inside and toss the lid inward?" Crane's face tightened. He had help. "Then where are the tracks?" Eliza asked, her voice hardening. She pointed to the ground, lit by the spreading flames. "Look, there are 2 sets of boot prints, deep ones, running away from the fire. They are heading toward the shacks, toward where Lou Harker lives." She turned and pointed at the ground where Ash stood. "And there," she said, "are Ash's tracks, coming from the foothills. He came to the fire. The other men ran from it." A long, heavy silence. The only sound was the crackle of the flames and Thomas's ragged coughing. The teamsters looked at Crane. They were not smart men, but they were practical. They understood boot tracks and oil barrels. The cook's logic was simple. It was ironclad. Crane's face was purple. He had been made a fool of, publicly, by a woman. "This ain't settled," he growled, holstering his pistol. "This ain't investigated. You," he jabbed a finger at Ash, "do not leave this territory." He turned his horse violently. "Put out the fire," he barked at his men, and rode off into the dark, his humiliation a palpable thing. The depot crew, galvanized by a common purpose, formed a bucket brigade and began to fight the fire. Ash did not move. He was watching Eliza. She was kneeling by Thomas, wiping his face with her apron. She was shaking now, the reaction setting in. Ash came to her. He looked at her, and, for the first time, his eyes were not guarded. He was not looking at a white woman, or a cook. He was looking at an ally. He was looking at a warrior who fought with different weapons. "They will not stop," he said.
"I know,"
she whispered. "It is not safe for you here, or the boy." The fire was mostly contained, but the storehouse was a ruin. Martha was weeping by the porch. "Come," Ash said. "I will take you where you can breathe, just until the sun comes up." She trusted him. She helped Tomas to his feet, and the 3 of them slipped away from the smoky chaos of the depot, melting into the pre-dawn shadows. He led them on foot, away from the town, up a dry wash and into a narrow canyon that Eliza had never known existed. Just as her legs were giving out, the canyon opened up. It was Coyote Spring. It was not a grand place. It was a cluster of cottonwood trees, green and vibrant, surrounding a pool of clear, dark water that bubbled up from the red rock. Several hogans, the traditional dine dwellings, were settled nearby. It was quiet. It was orderly. It smelled of juniper smoke and clean water. He took them to a hogan where an old woman sat by a small fire, weaving. Her face was a beautiful map of 100 years. This was Shiyazayastza, his grandmother. She looked at Eliza and Thomas, her eyes sharp and knowing. Ash spoke to her in the rolling, soft sounds of the dine language. The old woman nodded. She looked at Eliza. She did not smile, but her eyes were not unkind. She spoke, and Ash translated. "My grandmother says you have the spirit of a person who sees what is not what she is told." The woman spoke again, her eyes on the fire. "She says," Ash continued, "the path of truth is the long one. It has many rocks, but it is the only one that does not lead you off a cliff in the dark. It is the safe path, even when it is hard." The old woman, Shiyazi offered Eliza a cup of hot, pine-tasting tea. Eliza took it. It was the first safe, warm thing she had felt all night. They stayed only an hour, long enough for Thomas to sleep, long enough for the false dawn to light the sky. Ash led them back, using the ridges to keep them hidden. He left them at the edge of the depot's cleared yard. The sun was rising. The storehouse was a black, smoking skeleton. "I will come back this evening," Ash said, "when I can." It was a promise. Eliza nodded. She took Tomas inside, back to the kitchen, which was untouched. She barred the door. She looked at her hands, raw from the axe in the fire. She washed them. She rebuilt the fire in the stove. She took out the flour that had been saved, and she began to make the day's bread. She would cook his supper. The silence in her kitchen was no longer just a refuge. It was a pact. The fire changed the math at Langtry's depot. Marshal Crane, cheated of his public arrest, now needed a new story. He settled on vagrants, a thin tale about drifters catching a spark in the dry tinder of the storehouse. Nobody in Mesquite Crossing believed it, but it was the official story, and Crane was the official law. He made a show of riding patrols, warning everyone about the transient danger. It was a warning meant for one man. Ash did not need the warning. He knew the fire was a message. He spent the day after the fire not near the depot, but miles away, at Dry Wash. The sandstorm had scoured the tracks of the original ambush, but Ash was not looking for what the wind had erased. He was looking for what it had hidden. In a shallow arroyo, protected from the worst of the wind, he found them, the tracks Eliza had spoken of. They were not the prints of shod ponies, the kind his kin rode. They were the deep, wide grooves of a heavy freight wagon. He knelt, tracing the impression in the hard-baked mud. The wheels were new, reinforced with a wooden framework he had seen only once before. Mesilia Freight. The company was big, with contracts all the way to Santa Fe. It was run by men who did not care about the land, only what they could haul across it. And their biggest partner in the territory, the man who guaranteed them safe passage and water, was Cyrus Pike. Ash now knew the name of the shadow partner in Crane's theft. At the depot, a new quiet settled in. It was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of a siege. The teamsters, seeing the burned-out storehouse and sensing the bad blood between the depot and the marshal, began to stable their mules elsewhere. The dining hall was often empty. Martha Langtry was a ghost in her own establishment. The fire had broken something in her. She watched Eliza, her eyes a mix of fear and a new, grudging respect. This cook, this girl, had saved Tomas. Martha had seen her face down the marshal. The widow was trapped, but she stopped her petty snapping. She left Eliza to her kitchen, and the kitchen became the center of the world. Eliza's day was ruled by the stove. She baked bread. She stewed beans. She scrubbed the great cast-iron pots. Her routine was the only thing holding the depot together. And every evening, just as the sky turned the color of a fading bruise, she made one extra plate. She wrapped it in a clean cloth, keeping the cornbread warm, and set it by the kitchen's back door. Ash kept his promise. He no longer came to the dining hall. He came as a shadow, just after sundown, a shape moving between the corral and the kitchen. He would knock, a soft tapping, just 2 beats. Eliza would open the door. "Supper," he would say. "It is ready," she would answer. She would pass him the plate. He would pass her the empty one from the night before. Clean. Sometimes their fingers brushed. It was a ritual. It was the only time either of them felt safe. In this silence, they began to speak. Eliza, raised by nuns who taught her the quiet power of symbols, began to use the food. It was her only weapon, her only way to send a message. One night, Ash unwrapped his plate and found 3 dried, fiery red chilies tucked next to the bread. He stopped. He read the sign, "Danger." He faded back into the hills, and later learned that Marshal Crane had been inside the depot, drinking, asking questions about Eliza for nearly an hour. Another night, a sprig of wild mint. which grew by the water trough, was laid across the stew. He knew it meant the depot was quiet. The path was clear. And one evening, when she needed to see him, truly see him, she placed 5 whole kernels of unpopped corn in a small circle on the cornbread. It was a request. "I must speak to you." He ate quickly, then waited in the deep shadow of the blacksmith's forge. When Eliza was finished cleaning, she dumped the dishwater, an act she always performed, and walked toward the shadows. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Pike's men were here," she said, her heart pounding. "Lou Harker. He was talking about the cattle. He said Pike is moving his whole herd into the valley next week. He said the marshal guaranteed him Coyote Spring." Ash nodded, absorbing the information. "They move fast. I found the wagon tracks. Massilia Freight. Pike is using them to haul his supplies." They were the ones who staged the first robbery. They stood there for less than a minute, 2 spies in their own land, before she slipped back to the kitchen. The war was being fought with whispers and wagon tracks, and now with bread and beans. Ash knew he needed more. The wagon track was not enough. He needed something to tie Pike and Crane together, something solid. He spent his days ranging wide, watching the Massilia wagons, tracking the movements of Crane's deputies. He was 3 days out, riding a high ridge that overlooked the main trail to Santa Fe, when he heard it. A single rifle shot, echoing up the canyon. He dismounted, tethering his horse in a dense stand of juniper. He moved on foot, silent as the lizard on the rock. Below him, on the trail, he saw a riderless horse, a mail pouch lying in the dust. Then he saw the man, a young male rider, crawling toward a patch of shade, leaving a dark trail. Before Ash could move, another man stepped out from the rocks. It was Lou Harker. He was holding his hand, which was wrapped in a bloody bandage. He must have recognized Ash's horse, or his shot. No, that was not right. The bandage was old. Harker had not seen Ash. He kicked the wounded mail rider, rolling him over. He was not interested in the man. He was interested in the mail pouch. He tore it open, spilling letters into the dust. He was searching, frantic. Ash did not shout. He raised his rifle. He did not aim for Harker's chest. He aimed for the rock face just beside his head. The bullet struck the rock, exploding into 1,000 pieces of stinging granite shrapnel. Harker screamed, grabbing his face, and spun around. Blind. "The next one is for your heart," Ash called out, his voice calm. Harker, seeing the figure on the ridge, did not hesitate. He scrambled for his horse and galloped away, leaving the mail, the rider, and the pouch behind. Ash slid down the scree slope. The mail rider was young, choking on his own blood. A bad wound, high in the chest. They shot me," the boy whispered. No, he was looking for... He was dying. Ash knew he had minutes to get him to the doctor in Mesquite Crossing, but his eyes fell on the scattered letters, and on one thick envelope, sealed with red wax. It was not addressed to a citizen. It was addressed to Cyrus Pike, and marked with the stamp of the Atchison, TOPEKA and Santa Fe Railway. Harker had not been robbing the mail. He had been sent to intercept this. Torn, Ash looked at the dying boy. He made his choice. He ripped open the envelope. It was not a letter. It was a contract. Pages of small, dense type. He could not read all the words, but he knew the names. Cyrus Pike, Marshal Abel Crane. He knew the numbers. $10,000. And he knew the purpose. He spelled out the words: compensation for successful relocation of all native families, and the full legal forfeiture of water rights known as Coyote Spring. This was it, the proof, the reason for the murders, the lies, the fire. The railroad was paying Pike and Crane a bounty to steal the land. Ash stuffed the contract into his shirt. It felt like it was burning his skin. He lifted the wounded boy, who was now unconscious, and threw him over the saddle of his own horse. He swung up behind him and rode. He rode faster than he had ever ridden, not caring who saw him. He left the boy at the doctor's doorstep in Mesquite Crossing, pounding on the door until a light came on, then vanished into the alleys before he could be seen. The male rider would live, and Ash had the weapon he needed. While Ash was on the trail, Marshall Crane was waging his own war. He could not arrest Eliza, not after she had saved Tomas, so he attacked Martha. He walked into the depot, not with a gun, but with a clipboard. "Martha," he said, his voice slick, "it has come to my attention that this depot is in violation of territorial codes." Martha, who was standing behind the empty counter, shrank. "What are you talking about, Abel?" "Unsafe structures," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the burned storehouse. $100 fine, failure to maintain a clear perimeter, $50, and harboring known agitators. "Agitators?" Martha whispered. "That dine Ash. He comes here. You feed him. You give him aid. That makes you a party to his crimes. I am impounding your freight license, effective immediately. And I hear," he leaned in, his voice dropping, "that Mr. Pike is very concerned about that mortgage he holds. He feels unsafe with his investment." He slapped the papers on the counter. "Pay the fines by tomorrow, or he forecloses." He left. Martha sank into a chair. She was ruined. The fines were impossible. The loss of the license was a death sentence for a depot. Eliza had heard every word from the kitchen. She felt the cold rage build. This was her fault. Her and her truth. She looked at the account ledger on the small desk, the book where she had written the truth about the knife. It was the first link in the chain. The contract Ash held was the end, but her ledger was the beginning. She could not let Crane seize it. She waited until Martha was in her office, weeping. Eliza took the heavy ledger. She wrapped it in a burlap sack. She walked out the kitchen door, into the pale afternoon sun. She felt like every window in Mesquite Crossing was an eye staring at her. She walked past the saloon, past the marshal's office, and stopped at the small, white-painted church. Reverend Miles, the young pastor, was sweeping his own porch. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Miss Hart." Eliza was out of breath. "Reverend, I need sanctuary, not for me, for this." She walked past him, into the cool, quiet church, and placed the wrapped book on the pulpit. She unfolded the burlap. "This is the depot's kitchen ledger," she said, her voice echoing in the small space. The pastor looked confused. "A ledger. Turn to the last page," she said. He opened the book. He read the entry, his finger tracing the lines. Items missing: one large butcher knife, Le carved near hilt. His face went pale. He was not a fool. He had heard the rumors. He had heard Crane's story about the evidence at the robbery. "This is," he whispered. "This is the truth." Eliza said, "Marshall Crane is seizing the depot to bury it. I heard you studied law, back east. I need you to witness this. I need you to seal it. And I need you to hide it, where a man like Crane would not dare to look." The young pastor looked at the book, then at Eliza's fierce, desperate eyes. He was a man of God, but he was also a man who believed in the laws of men. He saw a crime. "Yes," he said, his voice finding a new strength. "Yes, I will." He found sealing wax in his father's old signet ring. He wrote a note, declaring he had received the book on this day, June 12th, 1883. He sealed the book shut, the wax dripping onto the cover. "It will be safe in the church vault," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "God willing." "Thank you, Reverend," Eliza said. She felt a small bit of the weight lift. She had anchored her truth in solid stone. That night, the wind came back, howling down from the mountains. It was a cold, bitter wind that smelled of pine and distant snow. Eliza was cleaning the last of the supper pots when she heard it. A howl, long and low, not a coyote. Another howl answered it, and another. Then the horses in the corral began to scream. Thomas ran into the kitchen, his face the color of flour. "Eliza, wolves, a whole pack. They are at the fence." Eliza grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a cast-iron skillet, and ran to the porch. In the lantern light, she could see them, 8, maybe 9, gray shadows, their eyes glowing green in the dark. A big male was lunging at the corral gate, throwing his weight against it. The horses were trampling each other in panic. "The rifle!" Eliza yelled. "Martha took it to town," Thomas cried. "The firing pin is broken." The gate's top hinge splintered. The wood was about to give way. The horses would be torn down in the yard. A shot exploded in the night. It did not come from the depot. It came from the darkness beyond the light. The bullet did not hit a wolf. It slammed into the dirt 3 feet in front of the lead male. The pack froze. Ash rode into the circle of light, his rifle resting on his arm. His horse was perfectly calm. He fired again, this time into the air. The sound, combined with the man's absolute lack of fear, was too much for the wolves. They broke, scattering like smoke, vanishing into the windy dark. Ash dismounted, his rifle never leaving his arm. He walked to the panicked horses, speaking in a low, soft voice. Sounds Eliza did not understand. The animals quieted, their terror easing, their ears turning to him. He took the lead mare's rope and led her, and the rest, out of the broken corral and into the shelter of the blacksmith's forge. Eliza walked out to meet him, the skillet still heavy in her hand. The wind was whipping her skirt around her legs. "You are always here when the trouble starts," she said. "This is not trouble," he said, tying the rope. "This is just the land. They are hungry." It was then she saw it, a dark stain on his left sleeve, just below the shoulder. "You are bleeding," she said. He glanced at it, as if it were an annoyance. "It is nothing. A branch. That is a bullet graze. Ash." She knew the look of it. He did not deny it a second time. "Sit," she said, pointing to the porch steps. He looked surprised by her tone, but he sat. She ran back to the kitchen, emerging with her box of supplies, a bowl of clean water, lye soap, and strips of clean linen. She knelt in the dirt in front of him. "This will sting," she said. She pushed up his sleeve. The bullet had torn a long, raw groove through the muscle. It was dirty. She soaked a cloth and began to clean the wound. He did not make a sound, but she felt the muscle of his arm bunch into iron beneath her hands. "Hold still," she commanded, though he had not moved. He was watching her. His face was very close to hers. She was focused entirely on her work, her brow furrowed, her lips set in a firm line. She was not gentle, but she was careful. She was not afraid of the blood. She finished cleaning it and took a strip of linen, binding it tightly around his arm. As she tied the knot, her fingers, rough from lye and heat, brushed against the warm, uninjured skin of his bicep. It was the first time they had truly touched. A current, sharp and sudden, passed between them. It was more powerful than the wind, more real than the fear. Eliza's hands fumbled on the knot. She pulled back quickly, her face hot. She began to gather her things. "Thank you," Ash said. His voice was lower than usual. "You saved the horses," she said, not looking at him. "You saved my kin, with the knife," he replied. "You saved me from the fire." She finally looked up. The wind was tearing at her hair, pulling it from its pins. He was staring at her, and the usual calm in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a fire, a heat that was not anger. They had not spoken a single word of love. They had not spoken of tomorrow. But they had bled together. They had fought together. They had chosen their side. Pike and Crane did not wait. The fire at the depot, and Eliza's public defense of Ash had made them fools. Fools do not forget, and powerful fools move quickly. 2 days later, Marshal Crane, in his official capacity, nailed a notice to the depot's front door. It was a court order, signed by a circuit judge over in Prescott, a man known to enjoy Pike's whiskey and his money. The order declared the families at Coyote Spring a public nuisance and immediate health risk. It authorized Marshal Crane to remove by force if necessary all persons and property from the spring, effective in 3 days' time. The health risk was a new, ugly whisper. It started with a freight driver, one of Pike's Mesilla men, who claimed a dying child near the spring looked pockmarked. The word spread, carried by fear. Smallpox. It was a lie, but it was a good lie. It was a quarantine of the soul. People who had been neutral, even friendly to the dying, now crossed the street. They looked at the high desert, at the mesas where the native families lived, as a source of plague. Martha Langtree, terrified, forbade any dying from coming within 100 yards of her depot. It is for their own good, Eliza and ours. She'd rationalized, her hands shaking. The marshal says he will burn any place that harbors the sick. Eliza looked at her. You know it is not true. Martha? What I know, Martha snapped, her fear making her cruel, is that I am a day from losing this depot. Truth will not keep the roof over our heads. The depot was an island. The town had drawn a line, and Eliza and Martha were on the wrong side of it. That afternoon, Eliza was sweeping the yard. It was a useless, angry task. The wind brought the dust back as fast as she moved it. She was sweeping the hard-packed dirt near the porch, the same spot where Marshal Crane's horse had stood the day he arrested Ash's kin. Her broom, made of bound twigs, scraped something hard and small. It was not a rock. She bent down. Half buried in the dust was a small brass cylinder, green with verdigris. It was a shell casing, but it was not the thin brass of a pistol round or a common repeater. It was thick, heavy-gauged, with a wide mouth. She had seen it before. She had seen a box of them on the marshal's own desk when she'd gone to deliver his lunch. Weeks ago. They were for his prized rifle. A heavy-caliber Sharps, the one he claimed could stop a buffalo. He had not just planted the knife. He had been here. His men had fired the shots from the depot yard, in the cover of the sandstorm, to make it sound like a raid. Then they had ridden to dry wash to finish the job. The ambush had been staged right here, in her yard. Her hand closed around the warm brass. It was another piece of the truth, hard and cold. That night, Ash came for his supper. The sprig of mint she had placed on the bread had been replaced by 5 kernels of corn. I must speak to you. He did not wait by the forge. He melted from the shadows as she stepped onto the back porch. He had the railroad contract in his shirt. His arm, she saw, was healing clean. They have set the day, he said, his voice flat. 3 days. My grandmother will not leave. None of them will. I know, Eliza said. She held out her hand, palm up. The shell casing gleamed dully in the starlight. I found this where Crane stood. He looked at it, then at her, his eyes sharp with understanding. He fired from here. The sound was covered by the storm. They staged it all, she whispered. Not all, he said. They were clumsy. Lou Harker, the one who shot the mail rider. I saw his track from the ridge at Dry Wash, before the storm. He was looking for something he lost. A box, I think. The freight, Eliza breathed. Pike's freight, Ash said. Mesilla. If they were hauling Pike's goods on the wagon, they pretended to rob. A crate with the company's name on it would tie them together. Where? He was searching near the high cliffs, the place you call Painted Mesa, near the wind cave. We have to find it, she said. He shook his head. It is my fight. It is my kitchen knife in Crane's evidence bag, she countered, her voice fierce. It is my yard where he fired his gun. I am not asking. Ash, I am going. Tomas, who had been listening from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, stepped out. I am going too. Ash looked at the boy, then at Eliza. He saw the same iron in both of them. He was a warrior, used to walking alone, but he was not alone anymore. "The horses are ready," he said, and it was settled. They rode before dawn, 3 shadows moving against a pale gray sky. Ash led them up into the painted mesa, a landscape of towering red and orange rock, carved by wind into fantastic shapes. The wind cave was not a cave, but a narrow, twisting slot canyon, barely wider than a horse. They dismounted, leaving the horses at the entrance. The air was cool and still. "They would have brought the wagon through here, to hide their tracks," Ash said. They walked for 10 minutes, the canyon walls rising 100 feet above them, blotting out the sun. "There!" Tomas yelled, his voice echoing. He pointed. Wedged in a tangle of dead branches from a previous flood, 20 feet up the canyon wall, was the wreckage, a splintered wooden crate, its side bearing the black stenciled letters MESILLA FREIGHTCO. "I can get it," Tomas said, scrambling up the rocks. "Be careful," Eliza called out. Ash was not looking at the crate. He was looking at the sky, visible as a thin blue ribbon far above. He lifted his head, sniffing the air. It was clear, hot and still, but the smell was wrong. It smelled of wet rock and ozone. "Rain," he said, his voice urgent. "Far away, in the mountains. It is coming." "It is not raining," Eliza said, shielding her eyes. "It does not have to rain here." He looked at the high, dry walls. "Thomas, get down now." The word was barely out of his mouth when they heard it. A low, distant rumble, like a train. It was not thunder. It was the sound of the earth, growling. "Climb!" Ash yelled. He shoved Eliza at a fissure in the rock face. "Up as high as you can." The rumble became a roar. Tomas, holding the splintered piece of wood, jumped from his perch, landing hard in the sand. He looked back down the canyon. A 10-foot wall of churning, brown water, filled with logs and debris, was roaring toward them. "Ash!" Eliza screamed. Ash grabbed Thomas by the shirt and threw him toward Eliza. "Climb!" He pushed them both up the fissure, jamming his own back against the rock to give them a foothold. The water hit. It was not water. It was a liquid hammer. It struck Ash, pulling him from his brace. He grabbed the rock, his fingers clawing for a hold. Eliza and Thomas were on a narrow ledge, 10 feet up. The water was below them, but it was rising, swirling, and pulling. "Ash!" Eliza screamed, reaching down for him. He was in the torrent, clinging to a small rock. The water was pulling him, trying to suck him down the canyon. "Hold on!" Thomas yelled, terrified. Then the ledge they were on, soaked and undermined, gave way. With a sickening crack, the rock began to slide. Thomas cried out, tumbling, his hand flailing. Eliza grabbed his wrist, stopping his fall, but his weight, combined with the sliding rock, was pulling her over. She was dangling, holding the boy with one hand, her other hand scraping against the sandstone, her fingers raw. "I have got you, Tomas, I will not let go," she screamed. But she was slipping. Her strength was gone. A hand, strong as iron, locked around her arm. Ash. He had found a foothold, one solid piece of rock, and had braced himself. The water raged around his waist, but he held. He was holding her, and she was holding Tomas. They were a chain, and he was the anchor. "Climb," he grunted, the word forced from his lungs. He did not just pull, he lifted. He used the last of his strength to shove Eliza upward, back toward the fissure. She scrambled, finding a hold, and then, together, they hauled the coughing, terrified boy up onto a high, stable ledge, just as the main crest of the flood tore the rock they had been on to pieces. They collapsed on the high ledge, soaked, shaking, and alive. The piece of stenciled wood was gone, swept away, but Tomas, in his panic, still gripped a piece of paper. It was the wagon's manifest, the shipping list, soaked but still readable. Massilia freight. The flood raged for an hour. Then, as quickly as it came, it was gone, leaving a river of thick, red mud. They rode back to the depot in a heavy silence. They were bound now, not by attraction, but by something deeper. They had held each other's lives in their hands. When they entered the kitchen, Martha was waiting, her face grim. "Pike was here," she said. Eliza felt a new chill, colder than the floodwater. "He did not come for me," Martha said. "He came for you, Eliza." Eliza looked at her. "He offered me a job," Eliza said, her voice flat, "as his housekeeper." Martha looked at the mud on Eliza's dress, at the raw scrape on her face. "A housekeeper," she repeated, her voice dripping with 100 years of female understanding. "The pig." "I told him no." "Good," Martha said, a spark of her old self returning. "Good. Then we are in this together." Tomas handed Martha the soaked, muddy manifest. "We found this." Martha took the paper. She looked at the names, at the Mesilla logo. She nodded. She walked to the large bin of cornmeal in the corner, the one Crane's men had not touched during their search. She plunged her arm deep into the yellow powder, hiding the paper at the very bottom. "Let them come," she said. "Let them search." Cyrus Pike, his offer rebuffed, did not wait. His pride was as vast as his land, and Eliza had wounded it. He went straight to the marshal. The next morning, Crane rode into the depot yard, 2 deputies behind him. He was not there for a fine. He was there for a fight. "Ash," Crane bellowed, his hand on his gun. "I have a warrant for your arrest signed by Lou Harker harassment and threatening a citizen. Come on out, or we are coming in." Eliza's heart stopped. Ash was not here. He was checking the spring. It was a trap. But before Crane could dismount, Martha Langtry stepped onto the porch. She was holding her husband's old, double-barreled shotgun. "He is not here, Marshal," she said, her voice shaking but loud. "Put that down, Martha." Crane sneered. "Before you get hurt, I am searching this depot." "No, you are not." The voice came from the road. Reverend Miles was walking quickly toward them, his black coat flapping. He was holding his Bible. "This is official business, Reverend." Crane snarled. "Get out of the way." "It is God's business when the law harasses the innocent," the pastor said, standing beside Martha. 2 old women and a preacher. Crane laughed. "A fine army." He raised his hand to signal his deputies. "Wait!" Martha shouted. She did not look at Crane. She looked past him, at the town. She walked to the heavy iron triangle hanging by the door and grabbed the metal striker. She began to beat it. Not the fast, steady rhythm for supper. She beat the alarm. Clang, clang, clang. Pause. Clang, clang, clang. The signal for fire. A minute of tense silence passed. Then, from the town, the deep bong of the church bell answered, slow and heavy, echoing across the valley. Men poured out of the saloon, the blacksmith, wiping his hands on his apron, the storekeeper. Women ran onto their porches. Within 2 minutes, 30 people were standing in the depot yard, looking at the marshal, at the preacher, at the old woman with the shotgun. They were looking for the fire. "What is it?" Martha, the blacksmith, called out. "The marshal," Martha said, her voice clear, "is here to arrest a ghost. He is accusing a man who is not here, based on the word of a man who works for Pike." Crane was trapped. He was surrounded by witnesses. His face was a mask of fury. He could not shoot his way out. He could not bully the whole town. "This is obstruction of justice," he yelled. "This is Tuesday morning, Marshal," the blacksmith said, crossing his huge arms. "Seems to me you are the only one obstructing any work." Crane looked at the faces. They were not hostile. They were just watching. and they would remember. He had lost the crowd. He shoved his pistol back into its holster. "This is not over," he seethed. "Not by a long shot." He and his deputies turned their horses and rode out, the eyes of Mesquite Crossing burning into their backs. Eliza, who had watched from the kitchen window, finally let out her breath. They were safe for one more day. The eviction was still coming. The day of reckoning at Coyote Spring was now just 2 days away. They had all the pieces of the truth. But Pike and Crane would not be coming with a judge next time. They would be coming with an army. The sun came up on the third day, not with a promise, but with a judgment. The light was thin and cold, making the high red mesas look like old bones. At Coyote Spring, the air was still, but the silence was a held breath. They were not alone. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the people had gathered. Ash's family, the Dine, were there. They sat near their hogans, wrapped in gray and red blankets, their faces quiet. They were not armed for a war. They were present, a quiet testament of belonging to the land. They were waiting to see what the white man's law meant. And with them stood the allies. Reverend Miles, his black coat already dusty, Martha Langtry, looking older than the rocks, holding her husband's old shotgun across her arms. She did not know how to use it, but she held it. The blacksmith, his arms crossed, a half-dozen small-time miners from the high canyons, men who had their own grievances about Cyrus Pike's control of water. Eliza and Thomas stood near the wagon they had brought from the depot. They had spent the night loading it, not with guns, but with food and water. They came just after 7 o'clock, a dark line moving against the rising sun. It was not just Marshal Abel Crane and his 2 deputies. Behind them rode nearly 20 men, a small army. They were not townsfolk. They wore matching gun belts and carried new rifles, and they rode under the banner of the Mesilla Freight Company. They were mercenaries, paid for by the pound. At their head, riding a fine black thoroughbred, was Cyrus Pike. He was dressed in his dark suit, as if he were attending a land auction, not a military eviction. He looked cool, confident, and clean. Marshal Crane trotted his horse forward. He unrolled a scroll of paper, his voice booming in the quiet morning. "By order of the Territorial Court of Arizona, and in the interest of public health and safety, I am authorized to clear this encampment. This land is forfeit. You are ordered to disperse immediately." Reverend Miles stepped forward, his Bible in his hand. His face was pale, but his voice did not shake. "Marshal Crane, by what authority do you enforce a lie?" "Get out of my way, preacher." Crane sneered. "This is the law. I do not have time for God." "This is not the law," Eliza said. Her voice, usually so quiet, cut through the air. Every head turned. She was standing on the bed of their small buckboard wagon, Thomas at her side. She was not shouting. She was speaking with the clarity of a cold fury. "You are right, Marshal," she said. "This is not about God. It is about evidence." Pike laughed, a short, dry sound. "Evidence. The girl is mad." "We have a chain of it," Reverend Miles said, stepping up beside the wagon. He pointed to the items they had laid out on the wagon bed, a strange collection for an altar. Eliza lifted the first item, the heavy, cloth-bound kitchen ledger. The wax seal the Reverend had placed on it was unbroken. "The depot's kitchen ledger," Eliza announced, "sealed by Reverend Miles 2 days ago. It proves that the butcher knife Marshal Crane claims he found at the dry wash robbery was, in fact, in my kitchen the night before. It was stolen. Marshal planted." The miners murmured. Crane's face tightened. Eliza lifted the small, heavy brass casing. "Your own shell casing, Marshal, for your heavy sharps rifle. I found this in the depot yard, right where you sat on your horse. The day you brought in those prisoners, the ambush was not at dry wash. It was staged from our porch, under the cover of the sandstorm." The murmuring grew louder. She held up the mud-stained, warped piece of paper they had pulled from the flood. The shipping manifest from the wagon that was robbed. It proves the wagon was not carrying public goods. It was carrying Cyrus Pike's private supplies, shipped by his partners, the Messilia Freight Company. She let that sink in. The mercenaries looked at each other, their rifles a little less steady. Then Eliza picked up the last document. The railroad contract.
And this,
she said, her voice ringing.
the reason. The contract that fell from your man's pouch. Marshall, a promise, $10,000, paid by the railroad.
To Cyrus Pike and Marshal Abel Crane. The price for the successful relocation of all native families from Coyote Spring. She looked at the crowd, her eyes blazing.
This is not a court order. It is a bill of sale. He is not enforcing the law. He is collecting a bounty.
A raw silence fell over the spring. The truth was laid bare, simple and ugly. Crane's face was a mask of purple rage. He was a bully, and a bully's only answer is force. That is, lies all of it, forgery, he screamed. I gave you a lawful order to disperse. He turned to the Messilia men, his voice cracking. Aim your weapons. Push them back. Push them all back. Now. The sound of 20 rifles being cocked was a terrible, metallic sound, like a clock striking doom. The mercenaries raised their guns. The women gasped. Martha Langtry fumbled with the shotgun. It was then Ash moved. He did not draw his gun. He did not run. He walked slowly, deliberately, out of the crowd of his family, past Eliza's wagon, and into the open, dead ground between the rifles and the people. He held his hands open, palms out. He did not look at Pike or Crane. He looked at the mercenaries. His voice was calm. My name is Ash, he said. I know some of you. I see Jeb Collins. I see Will O'Rourke. The men he named, at the front of the line, flinched, their eyes shifting. Jeb, Ash said, his voice carrying in the quiet. I pulled your son from the flash flood in the canyon last spring. He is 9 years old. He is well.
He is well,
Jeb Collins muttered, his rifle lowering an inch. Will, Ash said, turning his gaze. Your wife, Mary. She had the fever. My grandmother, she Yaji Azah. She found the root that broke it. You brought us thanks. He looked down the line of armed men. I have guided some of you. I have found your lost cattle. You are paid by Pike, but you live here. We live here. Will you shoot my grandmother for his money? Will you shoot the woman who healed your wife? The line of rifles wavered. Several men looked at the ground, their face tight with shame. They were hired guns, but they were men of the territory. They knew the truth when they heard it. Cyrus Pike saw his authority, the power he had paid for, dissolving in the morning sun. He was furious. This is sentimental nonsense, he shouted from his horse. Crane, do your job. Fire a warning shot. Show them you mean business. Marshal Crane, his power challenged by a cook and an Indian. His paid men hesitating, snapped. His rage was total. He ripped his own pistol from his holster. This is the law, he screamed, his face contorted. He fired his gun, not into the air, but toward the crowd, a wild, angry shot. A sharp, surprised cry came from beside the wagon. Tomas. The boy staggered, his hand flying to his shoulder. He looked at his fingers, then at Eliza, his face a mask of confusion.
Eliza,
he whispered. A bright red stain, impossibly red, blossomed on the white cotton of his shirt. The crowd, which had been silent, roared. It was not a sound of fear, it was a sound of animal rage. The miners surged forward. They have shot the boy, the blacksmith bellowed. Eliza jumped from the wagon. Her mind was split. She was a healer. She was a fighter. She grabbed Thomas, pulling him down. It is a graze, she said, her voice shaking, ripping a long strip from her petticoat. It went through. Tomas, hold this. Hold it tight. She pressed the bandage to the bleeding. Then she stood up, her hand on the boy's good shoulder. She faced the mercenaries, her face stained with Thomas's blood.
"They are shooting children!" she screamed, her voice tearing with a power she did not know she possessed. "They shoot children for money. We are not asking, we are not begging, we are telling you the truth. This is Pike's land grab."
"Silence her!" Pike yelled, raising his own pistol toward Eliza. But the world answered before he could fire. A violent, sudden gust of wind hit the clearing. It did not just blow. It struck. It tore the hat from Pike's head and the eviction notice from Crane's hand. The sky, which had been clear and gray, turned a sick, boiling yellow. "Sandstorm!" a miner yelled, his voice thin with panic. It hit them. It was not a storm. It was a wall, a 1,000-foot-high wall of red, stinging sand that erased the sun. The world vanished in a deafening, screaming roar. Men shouted, their voices ripped away. Horses panicked, screaming and rearing, unseating their riders. The mercenaries, blind, lost, and terrified, broke ranks. They were city men, hired men. They did not know this land. Crane was shouting orders, but the wind ate his words. Pike had disappeared, his horse bolting. Through the chaos, the Dine moved. They were not afraid. This was their land. This was their wind. "This way," Ash's voice cut through the howl. He was suddenly beside Eliza. "To the arroyo, low to the ground, Hozo, come." He grabbed Eliza and Thomas, pulling them down. His family, moving like shadows in the red dark, began to guide the panicked townsfolk, the miners, even some of the terrified, dismounted mercenaries, toward a deep, ancient cut bank, a dry riverbed that offered shelter from the wind's full force. They huddled together for what felt like an eternity, perhaps an hour. Enemies and allies, packed together, equals in the face of the land's raw power. And then, as quickly as it had come, the wind stopped. The silence was as sudden as the roar. They climbed out of the arroyo, coughing, their faces masked in red dust. The world was transformed. Pike's buggy was overturned. Crane, his face bleeding, was trying to rally his scattered, beaten men. But the scene had changed again. In the quiet, another group of riders had arrived. They had been guided by the standoff and forced to take shelter by the storm. At their lead was the blacksmith's brother, who had ridden all night from Santa Fe. And beside him, looking at the scene with wide, intelligent eyes, was a man in a city suit, holding a reporter's notebook. Reverend Miles, brushing the dust from his Bible, stepped forward. "Mr. Pike, Marshal Crane," he said, his voice calm. "You have arrived just in time to greet our guests. May I introduce Mr. Harris, from the Santa Fe New Mexican. He has been listening to our story all morning." The reporter looked at the armed mercenaries. He looked at the blood on Tomas's shoulder. He looked at the railroad contract, which the Reverend had shielded with his own body. He began to write, his pencil moving quickly. Crane looked at Pike. The game was over. They could not shoot their way out of this. They could not shoot a reporter. They could not arrest the whole town, which was now protected by the press. Crane's face was a terrible thing to see. He mounted his horse, his body stiff. "This is a conspiracy," he said, "a dangerous conspiracy." He pointed a trembling, dusty finger at Ash, and then at Eliza. "We are retreating, for now. The court order stands." He leaned down from his saddle, his eyes two burning coals of hate. He looked directly at Eliza.
"This is not over. We will settle this tonight."
He and Pike, and what was left of their broken army, turned their horses and rode away, disappearing into the red haze their own greed had stirred up. The depot was not a home, it was a fort. They had returned from Coyote Spring under a sky that was still a sickly, bruised red from the sandstorm. The reporter, Harris, was scribbling in his notebook, his eyes wide with the story of a lifetime. Reverend Miles had taken him, along with the precious cargo of the railroad contract in the ledger, back to the church, which he declared a public sanctuary. But Crane's last words hung in the air, heavier than the dust.
We will settle this tonight. Sunset was in agony. Every shadow that stretched across the yard seemed to hold a rifle. Martha Langtry, her face a mask of gray fear, sat in her rocking chair in the main room, the useless, heavy shotgun across her lap. Thomas, his arm in a clean white sling provided by Eliza, sat at the front window, his young face old with the burden of being a lookout. The depot was locked. The heavy wooden bars were dropped over the main doors and the back. In the kitchen, Eliza Hart worked. She worked because work was the only prayer she knew. She lit the stove, the cast iron radiating a steady, defiant heat. She moved in the familiar silence, her only answer to the screaming tension in the air. She put the heavy pot of pinto beans on to simmer. She mixed the cornmeal and buttermilk for the skillet bread. She set the great black pot of coffee to boil. The smells, rich and earthy, were a defense against the smell of fear and gunpowder. The only sound in the kitchen was the soft scrape of her wooden spoon against the iron pot. She was cooking. It was what she did. The night outside was absolute, the stars blotted out by the high, fine dust still hanging in the air. A soft knock came at the kitchen's back door. It was not a polite, civilized knock. It was a signal. 2 taps, a pause, 1 tap. Eliza moved to the door. "Who is it?" she whispered. "It is me," Ash's voice came, low and calm. She lifted the heavy bar. He slipped inside, and with him came another man, slighter, older, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. Ash bolted the door behind them. "This is Bigay, my cousin," Ash said. "We have set men at the spring, and 2 more in the rocks above the road. They will not surprise us." He was exhausted. She could see it in the lines around his eyes. He had been a negotiator, a leader, a fighter, and a general, all since sunrise. He looked at the stove, at the plates she had set on the counter. "You cooked," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of wonder. "It is my job," she said quietly. She turned and took a plate. She had kept it warm on the back of the stove, wrapped in a cloth. She handed it to him. She plated another for Bigay, who took it with a grateful nod and went to stand watch by the kitchen window, melting into the shadows. Ash sat at the small kitchen table, the one she used for kneading dough. It was the first time he had eaten in her kitchen. He did not eat like a man starved, but like a man honoring a ritual. He ate the pinto beans and the thick, crusty cornbread, and he drank the scalding black coffee. Eliza did not sit. She continued her work, wiping down the clean countertops, stacking the tin mugs. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of strangers, or even of allies. It was a heavy, deep quiet, filled with everything that had happened. The fire, the flood, the blood on the boy's shoulder, the touch of her hand on his wounded arm. The air in the small, warm room was too thick to breathe. It was full of the things they had not said. Ash finished his meal. He put the tin fork down on the empty plate. The sound was sharp, a single note in the quiet. He stood. He was a tall man, and in her kitchen, he seemed to fill the space. He did not move toward her. He moved to the dry sink, where she kept the pails of water. He picked up the dipper, poured clean water into the wash basin, and he washed his hands. He washed away the dust of the trail, the grit of the long, hard day. It was an act of deep, quiet respect. Eliza had stopped working. She was standing by the stove, her hands, white with flour, gripping the edge of a dish rag. She watched him. He turned. The lamplight, the only light in the room, carved his face from shadow. He walked to her. He did not reach for her waist. He did not try to kiss her. He simply stood in front of her, so close she could feel the heat of his body. He looked at her face, at the streak of soot she had missed on her cheek, at the raw exhaustion in her eyes. Then he looked at her hands, one of them still clutching the rag. Gently, he took the dish rag from her fingers and set it on the stove. He took her hand, the one that had bandaged his arm, the one that was chapped and red from lye and hot water. He held it in his own. He looked down at her hand, and then up at her face. His voice was a low whisper, a sound meant only for her, lost in the quiet hiss of the stove. "The Virgin cooked his supper in silence each day," he said, as if he were reading her history aloud. He lifted her hand, turned it over, and his head bowed. Navajo warrior kissed her hand. He pressed his lips to the back of her hand, a touch so light, so reverent. It was not a kiss, it was a brand. He raised his head, his eyes holding hers, the promise of 1,000 years in his gaze, and whispered, "Be my wife forever." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. This was not a question. It was a statement of destiny, a truth spoken as plainly as the one she had declared at the spring. He spoke again, his voice even softer, using the words of his people. "Hosho nahastli." He saw the question in her eyes. "It means," he translated, "we walk in harmony, we walk in beauty, together." She did not answer with a speech. She did not have one. She had been an orphan, a servant, a woman hiding from rumors. She had been silent all her life. He was the first man who had understood her silence. She simply nodded. Once, a deep, final, absolute acceptance. Then, she reached into the deep pocket of her apron. Her fingers found the small, stiff object she had been working on in the dark hours of the past nights. She pulled it out and pressed it into his hand. It was a small, tight braid, no longer than his thumb, woven from 3 strands of her toughest, whitest kitchen twine. It was the cord she used to tie a roast, to bind the things that held a home together. It was her answer. His large, calloused hand closed around the tiny, humble braid. It was a vow given and received. In the doorway to the dining hall, Martha Langtree, who had come to see about the noise, stood frozen. Beside her, Thomas, his good arm around her waist, watched. They had seen it all. Martha, the pragmatic, terrified widow, felt a warmth in her chest she had thought long dead. She put a finger to her lips, and Thomas nodded. They smiled, a shared, secret thing, and faded back into the darkness, leaving the kitchen to its owners. Ash's hand, the one holding the braid, moved to her other hand. He held them both. The promise was made. The war outside was forgotten. The world was this small, lamplit kitchen. A sound like a giant whip crack shattered the night. The glass of the kitchen lamp exploded. The room was plunged into total darkness, save for the sudden, angry orange glow of the stove's open firebox. Crash! Another sound, from the front room, the main window of the dining hall shattering. "Get down!" Ash roared, his voice no longer a lover's whisper, but a commander's. He did not pull her. He threw her, shoving her against the solid stone base of the chimney, tackling her, covering her body with his own as a spray of plaster and wood exploded from the wall where she had been standing. A bullet whined through the space where the lamp had been. "Tonight," Eliza breathed, the word muffled against his chest. He rolled off her, his rifle, which had never left his side, already in his hands. "Pike," he said, his voice a low growl. Another shot, then 2 more. They were surrounded. "Martha, Thomas Seller now!" Eliza screamed, crawling on her hands and knees toward the dining hall. "Big A!" Ash yelled toward the window. A single rifle shot, flat and sharp, answered from the darkness near the corral. Big A was returning fire. "They are coming from the road," Ash said, his voice cold and flat. "They mean to burn this place, with us in it." He looked at Eliza, who was not hiding, but crawling toward her pantry. The man who had proposed marriage was gone. The warrior was in his place. "I will go out the back. Big A and I will flank them. Keep the doors barred. Stay low." "I am not hiding. Ash," she said, her voice shaking but hard as iron. She had her hands on the heavy medical box the nuns had given her. "This is my kitchen. This is my station. I have bandages. I have boiling water. I have whiskey for the pain. You bring me any man who falls. I will be ready." He looked at her for a long second in the dim, red light from the stove. He saw the iron. He saw his partner. He saw his wife. He nodded, a sharp, fierce gesture. He moved to the back door, unbarred it, and looked at her one last time. "Hose-ho," he said. "Go," she commanded. "Be safe." He slipped into the night, a shadow born to hunt other shadows. Eliza dragged the kitchen table, upending it onto its side, creating a barrier. She lit a small, shielded candle. She laid out her linens, her bottles, and she began to tear the clean white cloth into strips. The battle for their lives had begun. The night exploded in gunfire. Ash and Bigay, now shadows among shadows, returned fire from 2 different points, their shots measured and accurate. The attackers, who had expected to terrorize a sleeping depot, were now in a firefight. They were not soldiers. They were Lou Harker and a half-dozen paid men from the Mesilla line. A torch arced through the air, landing on the dry roof of the corral. The hay inside caught instantly, flames licking up into the dark. The horses, trapped, began to scream in terror. "They are running," Bigay's voice called out. "Sharp." The gunfire stopped. The men on horseback, having done their damage, were retreating, galloping hard toward Mesquite Crossing. "The horses!" Eliza yelled, unbarring the kitchen door. Ash was already there, pulling open the flaming gate, his body low, his voice a calm, low chant. He and Bigay drove the panicked animals out into the open yard, slapping their rumps to send them clear of the fire. Eliza, Martha, and Thomas ran out with buckets of water from the trough. The corral was lost, but the depot itself was safe. "They will be back," Martha said, her voice dead, as she stared at the burning timbers. "They will burn us in our beds." "No, they will not," Eliza said, her mind clear and cold. She looked at Ash, who was staring at the tracks in the dusty road, visible in the firelight. "What is it?" she asked. "Their tracks," he said. "The left forehoof of Harker's horse. It is sawed, filed down, a trick to look like a lame animal, but it leaves a unique mark." "They went to town," Tomas said, his voice shaking. "They will get the marshal." "The marshal is with them." Ash said, "They are going to the Mesilla freight yard, to their own ground." "Then we cannot stay here," Eliza said, making the decision. "Martha, Thomas, we are going to the church. The reverend is there. The reporter is there. The evidence is there. We are safest in the light, with witnesses." Martha nodded, galvanized by Eliza's certainty. "Yes, the church." "Bigay," Ash commanded. "Take your rifle. Get on the roof of the general store. Watch the street. Watch the freight yard. I will follow these tracks. I will find the last piece." "And you?" Eliza asked, her hand on his good arm. "I will meet you at the church," he said. "Do not go alone." He looked at Bigay's cousin, one of the men who had been guarding the spring. "Take them. Keep to the alleys. Go." It was a nightmare flight. The 3 of them, led by the silent Dine warrior, scurried through the back alleys of Mesquite Crossing, a ghost, a boy with one arm, and a young woman. The town was dark, but lights were coming on. The gunshots had been heard. Ash moved in the other direction. He followed the distinctive cut track of Harker's horse. It led him, as he had known it would, to the high-fenced yard of the Mesilla Freight Company. The gates were barred. He did not bother with the gate. He went over the wall like a cat, landing in the silent yard. The office was dark. He used his knife to jimmy the cheap lock on the office door. He slipped inside. The room smelled of stale tobacco and ink. He lit a match. It was a simple room, a desk, a chair, a cold stove. On the desk was a heavy book, the company payroll ledger. The match burned down. He lit another. He ran his finger down the list of names. Harker, L, $50. Collins, J,
$50. Then, at the bottom, a different entry. In a finer hand, Marshall A. Crane. $500. Security bonus. This was it, the money trail. The proof that Crane was not just Pike's partner. He was Pike's employee. He tore the page from the book, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He was climbing back over the wall when he heard the shout. "Martha, you are in default. I am seizing your property." It was Crane's voice, coming from the street, near the church. Eliza, Martha, and Thomas had reached the church doors, pounding on them. Reverend Miles and the reporter. Harris yanked them open. "They are here," Eliza cried. "They burned the corral." Just as they got inside, Crane, Pike, and Lou Harker rounded the corner on horseback. They were not hiding. They were the law, and they were here to finish it. "Martha," Crane bellowed again, dismounting. "You have defied a court order. You have harbored a fugitive, and you have defaulted on your loan. I am seizing your person as collateral against Mr. Pike's property." He lunged for Martha, grabbing her arm. "No!" Martha shrieked, trying to pull away. Pike sat on his horse, a thin smile on his face. "It is just business. Martha, you should have taken my advice." Eliza saw it all in a flash. Crane was dragging Martha into the street. Harker was blocking the door. Pike was watching, his hand on his pistol. This was the end. They would take Martha, and the rest of them would be silenced, one by one. "Reverend," Eliza shouted, her voice ringing. "The bell!" She did not wait. She ran past them, past the altar, and scrambled up the narrow, dusty ladder into the church's bell tower. She grabbed the thick, greasy rope. With all her weight, she pulled. The first bong was a dead, hollow sound. The second was a deafening, echoing clang. "Stop her!" Pike screamed. Eliza pulled again. Clang, 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 the fire alarm. The sound of disaster, rolling over the dark, sleeping town. Lights came on. Doors slammed. Men, buttoning their shirts, ran into the street, carrying lanterns and rifles. "Where is the fire?" they yelled. They stopped. A crowd of 30 men, frozen, staring at the scene. They saw their marshal, Abel Crane, dragging the town's oldest widow by the arm. They saw Cyrus Pike, his gun drawn. They saw Lou Harker, a known bully, standing guard. "There is no fire," Crane yelled, his face purple. "Go back to your homes. This is official business." "It looks like thievery. Crane," the blacksmith shouted from the crowd. Pike's face was a mask of hate. He looked up. He saw Eliza in the bell tower, her hand on the rope. She was the one. She had raised the town. She was the one who had to be silenced. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim at the figure in the darkness of the tower. "Pike." The voice came from the alley across the street. Pike spun, firing his gun wildly at the sound. A shot answered from the darkness of the blacksmith's forge. It was not a wild shot. It was a single, perfect shot. The bullet struck the heavy steel of Pike's pistol. The gun exploded in his hand, a mess of shattered metal. Pike screamed, a high, thin sound, clutching his mangled, bleeding fingers. Ash stepped from the shadows, the ledger page in his left hand, his rifle smoking in his right. Crane, seeing his patron fall, seeing the crowd, seeing Ash, lost his mind. It was all over. He shoved Martha to the ground, ripped his own pistol from its holster, and aimed it directly at Ash's chest. "You red snake!" he screamed. "You are done!" "No!" Eliza screamed from above. She had seen it coming. There was a storm lantern on the bell tower landing, kept for emergencies. She grabbed it. It was heavy, full of oil, and lit. She did not hesitate. With a two-handed shove, she threw it, not at Crane, but at his feet. The lantern shattered on the hard-packed dirt, exploding in a brilliant, blinding flash of burning oil and glass. Crane screamed, his shot going wide as the flames ignited his pants.
He dropped his gun, beating at his legs, blind and terrified. In 2 bounds, Ash was on him. He hit the marshal with a tackle that sent them both sprawling in the dust. When they stopped, Ash was on top, his long butcher knife, taken from his belt, pressed hard against Crane's throat. "It is over, Marshal," Ash breathed, his voice raw. "Put the knife down. Son, let the law handle this." The voice was new. It was calm, deep, and held an authority that Crane's had never possessed. A man stepped into the light of the burning lantern fuel. He was tall, wearing a clean duster, and on his vest was a silver star. It was not a local star. "I am Deputy Marshal Evers," the man said, his eyes taking in the scene. "United States District Court. I've been on a train from Santa Fe for 2 days. The reporter, Harris, stepped out from behind him, his notebook already open. "Reverend Miles," Evers said, nodding to the pastor, sent a wire to the federal judge with his own sworn testimony. He mentioned a murder, a conspiracy, and a railroad contract. "It seems I have arrived just in time." Evers walked over to Crane, who was now sobbing in the dirt. He pulled Crane's star from his vest, contemptuously, and threw it in the dust. He pulled Crane's hands behind his back and cuffed him. Pike was on the ground, groaning, as the town's doctor ran up to tend to his bloody hand. "He will live," Evers said, looking down at him. "He will live to stand trial in Prescott, a federal trial." Ash stood, pulling the ledger page from his pocket. He handed it to the federal deputy. "Add this to your pile. His payroll proves he was Pike's man all along." Evers looked at the paper and nodded. "This closes the loop. The Reverend has the contract, and he has a certain kitchen knife, logged as federal evidence." The townsfolk, standing in the street, did not cheer. They did not hoot. They began to clap. It was a slow, steady, rolling sound of approval. A sound of order, not of violence. It was a sound of justice. Eliza walked slowly down the stairs from the bell tower, her legs shaking so badly she had to hold the wall. The crowd parted for her. She walked across the street, past the broken lantern, past the cuffed marshal, until she was standing in front of Ash. The lanterns of the townsfolk lit the street like daylight. He did not embrace her. She did not rush to him. They just looked at each other, the smoke and the chaos settling around them. He was the man who had seen her. She was the woman who had fought for him. He reached out his hand, the one that was not holding the rifle. She placed her hand in his, her fingers smudged with bell rope soot, his smudged with gunpowder. They did not say a word. They just stood there, holding hands, their promise sealed in the light. Weeks dissolved the sharp edges of the fight, smoothing them down with the ordinary grit of hot, windy days. The night of the confrontation had ended not with a riot, but with the clank of federal chains. Deputy Marshal Evers was a man who preferred paper to gunpowder. He had taken the railroad contract, the Mazilia payroll page, the church ledger, and Eliza's kitchen knife, placing each in a separate, labeled oilcloth bag. Cyrus Pike, his hand professionally set by the doctor and wrapped in white bandages, and Abel Crane, his face a mask of sullen silence, were taken on the 10 o'clock stage to Prescott. They were not local prisoners anymore. They were federal prisoners, and the weight of Washington had come down upon them. The reporter, Harris, had his story. It ran on the front page of the Santa Fe New Mexican, a scathing, detailed account of corporate greed, railroad bounties, and official corruption. The story was picked up by papers as far away as St. Louis. The Massilia Freight Company, exposed and shamed, had its territorial contracts revoked by the government within 2 weeks. Its high-fenced yard and Mesquite Crossing sat empty, the gates chained, the office already gathering dust. Deputy Marshal Evers returned, not with more soldiers, but with a surveyor. They rode out to Coyote Spring, where Ash and his grandmother met them. They did not argue. They watched. The surveyor hammered a heavy iron stake into the ground. deep between the roots of the oldest cottonwood. He affixed a brass plaque to it. The plaque stated, in deep, clear letters, that the water of Coyote Spring was designated a community resource. Protected by the Territorial Act of 1879, access was guaranteed to all residents. The land was safe. At Langtry's depot, the sound of wagon wheels returned. The teamsters, who had avoided the depot like a plague house, now found it was the only place to be. They praised Eliza's coffee. They laughed at Martha's newfound sharp tongue. The depot was full again. The tables crowded at noon and at 6. One afternoon, Martha Langtry received a letter, delivered by the new official mail rider. It was from the bank in Prescott, with Cyrus Pike's assets frozen by the federal court. All pending foreclosures had been reviewed. The lien on her property, having been proven part of a criminal conspiracy, was declared null and void. The debt was gone. That night, Martha took the faded gray ribbon she had worn for 10 years and threw it into the kitchen stove. She bought a new one, a bright blue one, from the general store. The depot was hers, free and clear. Eliza's kitchen became the heart of the town's new life. It was no longer just a stop for travelers. It was the place where Mesquite Crossing learned to live with itself. The miners, rough men with dust in their throats, came for her beef stew. The blacksmith, who had stood with them, ate there every noon. Then, the dine came. At first, it was tentative. A family came to trade for flour. Eliza, seeing them wait by the door, invited them in. She served them coffee. The white teamsters at the far table watched, their forks halfway to their mouths. But they said nothing. They had seen Eliza at the spring. They had seen her in the bell tower. Eliza learned. She learned from Ash in their quiet evening talks, and from his grandmother. She learned that the Dine preferred their corn roasted, their coffee black and unsweetened. She learned that they did not eat from a common pot of stew that mixed meat and milk. She set up a separate pot, her larder now stocked with beans and corn traded fairly from Ash's people. Her kitchen, the small room that smelled of bread and smoke, became a neutral ground. It was a place where a man was judged not by the color of his skin, but by the coin he put on the counter and the quiet respect he showed the cook. Tomas healed quickly, the bullet wound in his shoulder leaving a neat, clean scar. He was proud of it. The reporter, Harris, had seen the sharp, quick mind in the boy. He had seen his courage. Before Harris left for Santa Fe, he offered Tomas a position, an apprenticeship at the newspaper. "You have a good eye, son," Harris had said, "and you know how to tell the truth, even when it is hard." Tomas was torn. He loved Martha and Eliza. The depot was his home, but the world was vast, and he had seen how a pencil could be as strong as a pistol. He left a week later, on the eastbound stage, carrying one small bag and a new reporter's notebook. 3 weeks after that, a package arrived for Eliza. Inside was a copy of the New Mexican. On the 3rd page, below a story about the railroad, was a small, neat column. A note from the border, the truth about water. It was an honest, clear-eyed account of the lives of the Dene, of the greed for land, and the power of a spring. It was signed by Tomas Alvarez, special correspondent. Eliza read it, her heart swelling. She folded the newspaper carefully and tucked it into the drawer with her kitchen ledger. Ash still came every evening. He no longer used the back door. He came to the front, nodded to Martha, and walked into the kitchen. He would sit at the small kneading table, and Eliza would give him his plate. They ate in the comfortable silence they had built together, a quiet that was now more intimate than any words. One evening, after the meal, he stood. He had washed his plate and set it to dry. "My grandmother," he said, "wishes to see you. She wishes to welcome you to her fire." Eliza took off her apron. She did not ask why. She simply followed him. They walked out of the depot, away from the lights of the town, into the deep purple twilight. The air was cool and smelled of juniper. He led her along the familiar path to Coyote Spring. She Yajiazza was waiting for them. She was not weaving. She sat on a clean blanket outside her hogan, a small fire burning beside her. She looked at Eliza as she approached, her eyes deep and bright as a bird's, seeming to read the lines of her face, the strength in her hands. The old woman spoke, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Ash translated, his own voice soft. She says, "The path you walked to get here was a hard one. You did not stumble. You have a strong heart, a heart that belongs to this land." The old woman held out a small, intricately woven basket. In it was a pinch of yellow corn pollen. She took some on her fingers and gently, reverently, touched it to Eliza's forehead, then to her tongue. It was a blessing of beauty and balance. It was the taste of the sun and the earth. It was not a white man's wedding, with a contract and a judge. It was a welcome. It was Hozo. Eliza understood. She did not speak. She bowed her head, accepting the blessing. The peace was tested, not by men, but by the sky. The summer deepened into a cruel drought. The rains, which should have come in July, never arrived. The grass turned to brittle straw. The small creek that fed the town's wells slowed to a trickle, then to a series of rank, muddy pools. The depot's well ran dry. But Coyote Spring, fed by ancient, deep aquifers, still bubbled. It was lower than before, but it was clear, and it was constant. The town was thirsty. The new marshal, a quiet man named Elias Thorne, rode out. He pledged to honor the federal marker, but his men were thirsty. Fights broke out. The miners, their tempers short, argued with the dine women over whose turn it was to fill their barrels. The new peace, built on paper, was cracking under the hard, hot sun. Eliza watched this for one day. The next morning, at dawn, she took 2 empty wooden buckets from the depot. She walked through the town, past the angry men, and went to the spring. She waited her turn, quietly, behind a dine woman. She filled her buckets, nodded, and walked back. The next day, Martha Langtree, seeing her, picked up her own buckets and joined her. The blacksmith's wife, seeing Martha, did the same. The Dean women, who had been bracing for a fight, watched this silent procession. The next morning, 2 of them met Eliza on the trail, and they walked together. It became the water brigade. Every morning, the women of Mesquite Crossing and the women of the Dine formed a single, quiet line. They filled their buckets and their jugs. They shared the work. They handled the small disputes. They decreed that the water was for life, for cooking and drinking, not for washing wagon wheels or sluicing for rock. The men, seeing their wives and mothers walking together, fell silent. The life of the town was being carried on the shoulders of its women. In town, Marshal Thorne, seeing the peace, made it law. He, Reverend Miles, and the old saloon owner, who was now a firm ally of the depot, wrote out a simple agreement. They called it the Mesquite Crossing Coexistence Pact. It was 1 page, outlining the rules for shared water, for fair trade, and for mutual respect. They nailed it to the church door, next to the notice for the Sunday social. The depot was whole. The corral had been rebuilt, the raw pine smelling clean in the dry air. The kitchen was Eliza's sanctuary. One afternoon, in the quiet hour before supper, she took something from her apron pocket. It was the small, tight braid of white kitchen twine, the one she had pressed into Ash's hand, the one he had kept, tucked in his shirt. Through the whole fight, he had given it back to her, a silent question. When the peace was won, she stood on a wooden stool. Over the doorway, between her kitchen and the dining hall, was a small, dark wooden peg. She hung the braid there. It was not a decoration. It was a sign, a marker, like the one at the spring. It said, "This is home. This is the center. This is where we are bound." That evening, the knock came at the kitchen door. She opened it. Ash stood there, his rifle on his arm. home from a long patrol. He looked past her, his eyes finding the braid hanging in the doorway. He stopped. He looked at the small, humble token, and a slow, deep smile lit his face, a smile she had never seen before. He looked back at her, his eyes full of the promise. She smiled back. She did not need to speak. She turned to the stove, picked up the plate she had kept warm for him, and handed him his supper. They were married in the fall, when the air was sharp and the cottonwoods along the spring turned a brilliant, defiant gold. It was a wedding of two ceremonies, a binding of two worlds. The first part was in the town. At noon, in the small, clean church, Reverend Miles stood before them. The church was not full, but it was not empty. Martha Langtree, in her new blue ribbon, stood as Eliza's witness, her eyes wet. The blacksmith, his face scrubbed clean, stood as ashes. Marshal Elias Thorne was there, his hat in his hands. Eliza wore a simple blue dress, the one she had saved for Sundays. Ash wore a clean cotton shirt. They stood before the Reverend, who read from his book. They signed their names in the town's marriage ledger. Eliza Hart, her hand steady, her penmanship clear, and Ash, who signed his name not with an X, but in a strong, clear hand. Ta Tulichi. He was a man of two names, and he gave her both. The second part was in the land. That afternoon, as the sun began its long, red descent, they left the town, past the depot, past the rebuilt corral, and walked out onto the high prairie that led to Coyote Spring. Shiyazi Azza, his grandmother, was waiting. She was not alone. Her family was with her, sitting in a quiet, respectful circle. An elder, a man whose face was the color of the red earth, stood. He did not hold a book. He held a single eagle feather. He spoke, his voice the sound of the wind moving through dry grass. He spoke of the earth, of the water, of the sky, and of the path they walked. Ash translated, his voice low, for Eliza alone. He says we are two trees, planted in different soil, but our roots have found each other in the deep earth. He says our children will be the forest. There were no complex vows. They spoke the words they had agreed upon, the simple, practical, ironclad rules of their shared life. Ash spoke first, his eyes on hers. I will keep the house clean. I will keep the heart true. I will keep the word real. Eliza, her hand in his, spoke her reply. I will keep the house clean. I will keep the heart true. I will keep the word real. The elder raised the feather over their joined hands. It was done. The news from Prescott came 6 weeks later, not by rumor, but by the federal mail. The trial of Cyrus Pike and Abel Crane had been swift. The evidence, the railroad contract, the Massilia payroll, the church ledger, the knife, and the sworn testimony of Eliza, the Reverend, and the reporter Harris was a chain that could not be broken. Crane, his lies exposed, was found guilty of conspiracy, attempted murder, and abuse of his office. He was sentenced to 20 years in the federal prison at Yuma. Cyrus Pike, his hand permanently mangled, his power gone, tried to buy his freedom. But the judge was a federal judge, a man who could not be bought. Pike was found guilty of conspiracy, bribery, and inciting a riot. His lands, his businesses, all his assets, were seized by the government to pay his fines and to compensate the territory for the damage he had done. The verdict was more than justice for two men. The judge's final ruling set a legal precedent. It affirmed that water rights, especially those of ancestral communities, could not be seized by private greed or fraudulent public orders. The safety of Coyote Spring was now law, a case that would be cited in books for 50 years. Mesquite Crossing let out its breath. The shadow was gone. The town did not boom, but it grew. It grew better. With Pike's monopoly broken, new, smaller businesses opened. The miners formed their own cooperative. The depot was the center of it all. The small, one-room schoolhouse, which had been a dream, was built using timber from Pike's confiscated lumber yard. Reverend Miles taught on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Eliza, however, taught every day. She taught the children who came to her kitchen. She taught the dying children who sat shyly at her table, and the blacksmith's rough-and-tumble boys. She taught them their letters, using the labels on her flour sacks. She taught them their numbers, by having them count pinto beans. And she taught them how to cook, how to make a clean, nourishing meal from the land's gifts. Ash taught, too. He taught the boys, both white and native, how to read the earth, how to tell a sawed hoof from a true one, how to find water, how to respect the wolf, not just to fear it. He taught them how to live with the land, not just on it. A year passed. The seasons turned. The winter was hard, but the spring came with a deep, slow, soaking rain that lasted for 3 days. The land, which had been parched and weary, drank it in. The high desert exploded in a riot of blue and yellow wildflowers. The creek ran full and fast. The grass in the valley grew knee-high. It was a year of healing. It was an evening in that fine, new summer. Eliza was in her kitchen. The door was open to the cool breeze. The depot was loud, full of the sounds of men and women, of teamsters and dine, sharing a meal in the dining hall. She had a great pot of beans on the stove, the smell rich with salt pork and chili. The small braid of white kitchen twine still hung over the doorway, dark now with cooking smoke, a permanent part of the house. She heard his step on the porch, a sound she knew better than her own heartbeat. Ash came into the kitchen. He was home from a long patrol, tracking a mountain lion that had come too close to the flocks. He was dusty, tired, and beautiful. He did not speak. He walked to the dry sink and washed his hands. The ritual he had begun that first night, he dried them, and he turned to her. She was stirring the beans, a wooden spoon in her hand. He came to her, standing close. He took her hand, the one holding the spoon, and gently set the spoon on its rest. He turned her hand over, the hand that had grown stronger this past year. He bent his head. He kissed the back of her hand, just as he had done on the night of the siege. She looked up at him, her heart full. He smiled, the slow, deep smile that was hers alone. "Be my wife forever," he whispered. It was not a proposal. It was not a memory. It was a promise, renewed every day in the home they had built. A letter had come that morning. From Santa Fe, from Tomas. He was now a full-time reporter, his words carrying weight. He had enclosed his longest article yet. Eliza had it folded in her apron pocket. She knew the title by heart. When Justice Begins in a Kitchen. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the high mesas in shades of fire and rose, down by Coyote Spring, where the water ran clear and the grass was thick. A new sound had become common. It was the sound of children. The children of the depot and the children of the Hogans were running together in the twilight. They were flying kites made of newspaper and sticks, the tails of kitchen twine streaming behind them. Their laughter, high and clear, was louder than the wind. Far in the distance, miles to the south, a thin white plume of smoke moved along the horizon. The railroad. It was coming, a fact of the new world, but it was no longer a threat. It was just a train, passing by, in a land that was, finally, finding its own peace. The freedom of the West, Eliza knew, was not in the speed of a gun. It was in the slow, stubborn courage to live truly, and to live together. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.